Hello there, everyone. We last left this series off speaking on an old video from Mahler. This series was meant to be a retrospective not of the film The Last Jedi, as much as videos about it, as a sort of casual social study, but I think we might have to retread a little ground here. I was never satisfied with the first essay in this series, originally intended to be 9 parts, because while the YouTuber Shadiversity had some interesting things to say in the video we looked at, he spent a kind of absurd amount of time fixated on the wrong film. A lot of what he said was about The Force Awakens, the 7th episode in the franchise, and we're ostensibly here to talk about the 8th. I wouldn't inherently call it a bad idea to go over how The Force Awakens sets up The Last Jedi, but he mostly took issue with The Force Awakens on its own terms. So today we're here to talk about some of his other views, with special attention paid to lightsaber combat. You may have noticed that each of these videos covers not just a particular creator, but also a particular subtopic of the film. These people have definitely put a lot of work out about it. I'd guess there might be dozens, if not over 100 anti-TLJ YouTube videos. I don't know that I think they're all bad, but I've specifically selected creators who I think fed this subcultural movement, and who I don't think have grown as commentators beyond the kind of logic and analysis that we see here. If anyone has grown the least, it might be Shad. These days, he's largely a laughingstock of more or less every community except, well, the conservative community, and with good reason. He can't stop picking petty, vindictive, and pointless fights with other creators. Just this year, we've seen him tilt at Jack Saint, Scalagrim, and Angry Joe. Large portions of the internet have been left with a bad taste in their mouths, because Shad not only can't seem to figure out when his input isn't helpful, he mostly appears to speak out of a desire to aggressively and spitefully pressure other people to think like he does, with very little attempt at laying out his thought process in a coherent way. We're an eclectic, opinionated, melodramatic, and overly silly bunch, us YouTubers, but I think another reason I've been interested so much in responding to Shad, and why I've been making these Last Jedi videos, is that I wanted to take a small chance to build a profile of this online space, to show how the rhetoric and thought processes that get deployed here can be quite toxic, especially to something so oriented towards the earnest act of creating art as the reviewing process. In connection with my previous Mahler response, I want to be clear about something else. It's not necessarily bad outright to make content where you rage at something. We've all had a sensible chuckle or two at a man smashing his keyboard because he died in Dark Souls, or yelling at a movie in an over-the-top way. To a certain extent, guys like the Nostalgia Critic or the Angry Video Game Nerd, who I both brought up as parallels in the previous video, are actually loosely inspired in what they do by things like Mystery Science Theater 3000. MST3K was a television series that was a huge hit, despite essentially being some guys trapped in a goofy sci-fi premise riffing on B-movies. You've almost certainly seen references to this in other hit off-the-wall series like Yu-Gi-Oh! Abridged, or Futurama, or Lion King 1.5. These references have often made their way into my heart with little resistance, in exactly the same way MST3K seemed to for critics who came before. It all has this sort of intimate charm that nods to a culture and mentality that felt, at least for a little while, a bit niche. I don't think it's a coincidence that multiple of these series have been cancelled or delayed or gone straight to video, with only a dedicated fan base and even some successful crowdfunding to keep it all going. But nothing gold can stay, and now we've all got our podcasts and shows about podcasts, and react streams to react streams, and compilations of react streams to react streams in the wake of this increasing cultural phenomenon. Doug Walker has become a real employer, AVGN spawned a million commentators, and geeks have been playing their greatest hits with various versions of X movie thing isn't realistic, or here's what Y scene got wrong. It's all fun and games until the thing they got wrong was having a black person or a woman do a thing, or until you look to your left and look to your right, and realize that the over-the-top gamer rage that once made everyone laugh is now getting people legitimately angry, or feeding real resentment. This resentment has, of course, been captured before. Just ask Steve Bannon, or check our podcast episode where we talk about this in conjunction with the sequel films, or better yet, just watch the Innuendo Studios video about it. But it never vanished. It evaporated, but it's in the atmosphere, and every now and again here comes the rain. Speaking of which, here's some of what Shadiversity had to say about his views on how Rey uses a lightsaber in The Last Jedi. I knew we'd get to the topic of this video eventually. Have a little faith, everybody. Also, I know I've mentioned this before, but Watch for Shad doing the exaggerated angry white guy head bobble in this video. It always gives me a chuckle.
But Rey, okay, so we start with the training montage. Not looking at The Force Awakens, okay, I'm looking specifically at the training montage in The Last Jedi. And so Rey is there, and she takes this stance. This is the stance, okay? And she is holding it, and she goes like this, on one side of the rock, and she goes like this. Now, why is this a horrible, horrible sword fighting stance? If you guys know anything about martial arts or swordsmanship, you will know what I'm about to say, okay? This is horrible because there's no forward and back balance. This stance like this, okay? Get a solid knock, you don't go flying back. Why do you think in martial arts the stance is always a foot forward and the foot isn't directly back behind that one? It's off, okay? So this means you get forward and back stability and also side to side stability. This is the most fundamental stance in so many martial arts. But this thing, okay? No! It is wrong on so many levels, okay? And she keeps it through most of the training montage. So after she does the whole thing, you look here, and then she does this twirly thing, grabbing it like, and she grabs it in an underarm grip like this.
Now, Shad doesn't have to explain to me why, in a bout with two combatants using swords, a reverse grip is a horrible idea, because I watch Cell Sword Arts on YouTube and I'm well aware of the weird reverse grip discourse among HEMA and fencing practitioners. As a breakdown, you'll basically never want to hold a weapon like that in a grip like that, except in one combat situation, probably, where you're holding a knife and you're on top of someone, using your weight to press it down to drive it into the enemy combatant. That is quite literally the only time I can think of where this grip has any utility. Otherwise, it's not as strong, not as flexible, has a poorer range of movement, and generally doesn't accomplish much that a normal forward grip wouldn't already. For a Jedi wielding a lightsaber, I thought long and hard, and I think the only time this grip would have real utility is in one of three situations. First, when running, a Jedi could hold an ignited lightsaber in a reverse grip behind them to keep the blade out of the way. Second, when holding a double-bladed lightsaber, there might be utility in having one hand grip, part of the hilt such that, relative to one of the blades, there is a reverse grip. Third, and this one is my favorite, when utilizing Tricata, which is a kind of sneak attack that can get past an enemy's guard in a limited number of situations. The technique is very dangerous, but depending on how the combatants are positioned relative to each other, a reverse grip could be used to execute the technique without changing hands, as spinning the deactivated hilt in one hand would be faster, whereas strength would be irrelevant given the technique subverts the opponent's guard, and a lightsaber meets little resistance when it comes to a humanoid body, generally speaking. All that is to say that with very few exceptions, Shad is basically right about reverse grip, and otherwise he's generalizing a bit, but he does have a point in the abstract. I don't think it's correct for him to expand this to martial arts generally, but that's another subject entirely. However, if you have, seen the movie, then you might be confused. What training montage is he talking about? Rey does have several scenes with Luke, but they aren't cut together in a montage. In film, a montage is technically only a kind of sequence cut together rapidly. It has often been used to show the passage of time, which could be how some people read Shad's use of the term training montage. But the quick shots of Rey swinging the lightsaber around the rock aren't her training her lightsaber fighting skills. Shad is dressing this scene down implicitly as if the scene was showing Rey practicing lightsaber combat. But that's not exactly what's happening here. The quick cuts of shots in this scene are used to show the speed of Rey's actions as she swings the lightsaber faster and faster before she cuts the rock. This is her attempting to exert self-control and then losing it, a failure which results in her cutting the rock and sees Luke walking away from her up the hill. For a moment, even he seems to see her potential to conquer what Kylo Ren could not, and what Luke sees in her when he first teaches her about the Force and tells her to resist the darkness. He says she went straight to the dark because it offered her something she wanted. Similarly, in this scene, Rey is not struggling to be good at sword fighting like Shad pretends. She's struggling to control her actions as she swings around the rock, which is why these shots are cut with shots of the lightsaber going around the edges of the rock. This is a lot closer to that scene in Aliens where Bishop does the knife trick between the Space Marine's fingers, but Bishop is an android and Rey is a human. Her human imperfections beyond the physical and into the mental and spiritual are what's being tested here. She maintains control temporarily and then loses it.
And then you see kind of the camera is down, facing up, and you see her doing this. This isn't an over-exaggeration, this is what she is doing. I don't know who choreographed this mess, but it is an absolute dog's breakfast piece of junk, okay? Like, not only is the stance horribly wrong, okay? She's doing these wide baseball bat swings and ending like this, okay? Like, my soul dies a little bit watching it and thinking about that montage. You do not want to overswing when fighting with a sword, even with a lightsaber where there's not, no edge stuff, other video stuff, okay? But overswinging is bad because if you miss your mark, you're wide open, okay? Which is why not every, but a lot of sword strikes end with the sword remaining on point, okay? Where it's there or it's ready to go into another guard position.
I have a question for Shad here. Who does he think Rey was fighting in this scene? Does he think she was practicing fighting? Because her hitting and cutting the rock, the one cut that she actually does in the montage, is framed very harshly and as a failure on her part. If Rey was doing what Shad thought she was doing, then she would be failing where she succeeds and succeeding where she fails. It's hard to tell whether this is just an inability to understand the storytelling elements of this scene, or just a willingness on Shad's part to turn his brain off for a 2-minute hate. But either way, it's a bunch of nonsense, and sort of makes it sound like Shad doesn't have a strong grasp on the application of the Jedi philosophy. We talked about this in the previous video quite a bit, so I won't reiterate all those points here, but suffice it to say that this film is very concerned with light, dark, and balance, and most of Rey's actual lessons from her time with Luke pertain to this in a very direct way, including her attempt with the lightsaber. Her lack of control here is implicitly framed as a question of her worthiness as a Jedi, a question the film answers at its end. I'd like to take a brief detour here, because there's something we're building to with this video. You might have thought it was strange that my first video in this series was about Shad, but it wasn't a video about sword fighting, the thing that he's known for. This was because I wanted the first few videos exploring the specific gripes that people had with the series to be more of a profile in nostalgia and the lingua franca of angry nerd commentary coming from creators who, to my eye, are motivated in a way that a casual viewer wouldn't be. These creators have learned to speak to their audiences about these things in a manner which is rather conspicuous. By now you've noticed it, and if you haven't, you soon will. These approaches are loaded, the language is full of insinuations and implications, and all of it drips with everything from heavy exasperation to outright seething rage. The first video was about Shad's comments about the writing and how he engages with morality and storytelling, because I thought it was instructive to the larger cultural context of these Last Jedi videos. However, we're in the middle trilogy, and we're taking some time to get concerned with what some people might call the nitpicks. I think this is the wrong word for this type of thing. When characters in shows like Mystery Science Theater 3000 or its arguable new media YouTube equivalent, CinemaSins, make observations like this, they're being irrational, just venting at the film in a humorous manner. And previously, the principle behind this sort of thing was ostensibly that it's lighthearted and all in good fun. But I think this sort of thing has bred a kind of nastiness in nerd culture over time, because geeks watched this stuff and looked at characters making points in character and said, yeah, that's a good point, this movie is bad for the reasons you said. It's one of the reasons why the nostalgia critic is so hard to parse, because he's basically in character all the time in his reviews, and the character's stances are hard to distinguish from his, to the point that you start to wonder if the critic is the man himself, and he's always riffing but in the tonality of humor, by being primarily exaggeratedly angry, using weapons and depictions of violence or slapstick for effect. And I realized as I'm writing this that I'm sort of just talking about Shadiversity. Like I said earlier, Shad is basically just that guy. When you strip out the idea of playing a character distinct from oneself, and all the limited effects and set, you get a guy bumbling around angrily, saying things that sound like riffs but are actually just his opinions. It turns out that cultivating a culture of increasingly mean-spirited overreactions, using anger as a comedic device, might have both attracted and gone over the heads of a number of people who are now dominating that genre. A lot of people will be reminded of the concept of Poe's law, which is frequently invoked in a manner which I find distasteful because it frequently places the responsibility for how to read someone else's words entirely on the person who wrote them, for choosing to write something that could theoretically be misunderstood. Every time someone makes a joke that someone else could take seriously, the invocation of Poe's law is sure to follow. The actual Poe's law, however, is about the resemblance between a humorous hyperbole of an extreme viewer position and that actual position's real extreme qualities that already could theoretically contain the hyperbole. A common example of this idea is the concept of black comedians telling jokes about black people or black culture that cause laughter from white racists whose actual views are either indistinguishable from, or at least compatible with, the hyperbolic comedic presentation of racism and racial commentary. Similarly, in the genre of the rage review, what once was comedy with hyperbole for effect has at some point become a real phenomenon of creators mediating anger with laughter, without distinguishing their own real views from the hyperbole. I called this a lingua franca earlier, which is a term that refers to a linguistic construct used by two different groups speaking mutually unintelligible languages for the purpose of communication. And in a sense, that's true because the hyperbole of the humorous anger was meant to seem ridiculous, whereas laughably real anger is anathema to ridiculing the response of anger. However, there's a synthesis going on here. The humor is a vehicle for real anger, both as disguise in the sense of presenting what is ultimately not otherwise presentable, but also as self-delusion, as a kind of bad faith. This is a theoretical cultural criticism on my part, but from all of my exposure, I feel that both the humor and the anger are both real elements permeating this genre of video, and different videos contain different ratios of these elements, but both arise together, and it's caused me to do a lot of reflecting on what the real punchline of a lot of this is. Ultimately, I think it has something to do with catharsis. The laugh and the sneer can both at once be the same ugliness escaping its vessel, and you might well ask, if this is catharsis, what is it a catharsis of? I'd like to proceed to future videos in this series with these thoughts and questions in mind. Returning to the topic of laser swords for the moment, there are a couple more thoughtful characters who are figures of the online and YouTube HEMA community, and I'd like to look at a couple things they've said about the use of lightsabers and other kinds of laser swords or energy swords as sword combat, just for a taste of contrast.
Lightsaber choreography tends to be fairly cut-heavy. After a while, this can get kind of monotonous, so break up your next lightsaber fight with a thrusting sequence, like this. I'm gonna thrust at his leg, he's gonna parry that. He's gonna glazade to my leg, I'm going to yield parry and come up to his chest. He yield parries to my glazade, he comes to my shoulder, I yield parry, come off, and attack somewhere else. At speed, this looks pretty cool. It's interesting and it breaks up a very cut-heavy lightsaber fight. Try it out.
If we strike against each other, the question is, do they bind? Do they stick together? Do they bounce apart? Do they slide or can't they? Lots of things where no idea, depends on what it is. But let's assume they can slide. So in that case, we could actually use rapier techniques. So if they can slide, you can do things like this. You displace the blade to the side, come in for the thrust, or potentially, even if he throws a cut at me, I might even be able to just go in directly with a thrust.
That's just a taste of what some content creators like Sellsword Arts and Schologrim have put out there, where they talk through some ideas, implications, and interpretations of these concepts. Even when they're joking or being silly, you get a very different sense of tone from these videos. There's a certain direct, constructive sincerity on display here that you don't necessarily get from some of the other things we've talked about. But we can't leave without returning to Shad one final time for a fair look, so here's his brief comment on Rey's technique in the throne room sequence.
The thing about the Imperial Guard, here's a bit of commentary on when she's fighting with Kylo Ren against, those red guys, okay? It's bad. I mean, it's Hollywood action, flipping around, lots of movement, looks nice and stuff. But if you slow it down and watch a couple of key things, like the first engagement, okay? There's this red guy, he hits, he gets knocked back, and then he's kind of just spinning around and stuff like that, and he goes in for an attack, but Rey's actually going to get hit, so he has to pull the attack and purposefully miss. And so Rey should be dead there. And the most egregious thing about, and it's funny, she's not fighting the whole this way, like, in that fight scene, as they just go back to the Hollywood standard flashy stuff. But they really mess up the choreography in there, because there's one thing, there's this guy, okay, he's got this weird stuffy thing, and he splits it into 2 daggers, and he's fighting Rey with 2 daggers. And there's this part where he grabs Rey like this, and the knife in this hand disappears. They legitimately edit it out. Have a look, slow motion. You see this? There's a dagger, and Rey should be dead. She can't defend her back. The guy has a dagger right there. He could have stabbed her in the back, and they see this, and they're like, whoops, we'll just make that dagger disappear. Is that a new force power? Rey can make weapons disappear? I don't know, but she should be dead. Rey is legitimately the worst lightsaber fighting Jedi in all of Star Wars canon.
Now, scenes like this in film are not at all uncommon. For years, if you watched The Lord of the Rings, The Two Towers, with your geek friends, you would all have been ready to point out that scene where Éomer's sword falls out of its scabbard on his horse. The film is edited so they don't draw too much attention to it, but if you look, it's definitely there, and of course, Éomer rides away, so if that happens in the story, then he wouldn't have his sword later in the big battle, as he'd be leagues away and wouldn't have time to go looking for it, especially in the night while returning to help Theoden and the other defenders at Helm's Deep. If you listen to detractors of The Last Jedi for long enough, you'll start to notice that their veil of fixation is paper thin, because a lot of the arguments they make about why this film is bad could also apply to films they tend to love and even defend. This isn't really a refutation of their conclusion, as much as it is a refutation of their logic. These guys are frequently quite bad at film critique, to the point where people have started to notice over the years. Crucially, though, the 2 things Shad points out have nothing to do with Rey being a bad duelist. I don't know that this film trilogy puts a lot of energy into representing any special competency with a lightsaber on her part, beyond what you would expect from any given Jedi, but Shad's examples here are examples of stunt choreography. It's not on Rey the character, or even necessarily Daisy Ridley the actress, that the stunt person with the dagger in their hand was still holding it when she engaged them, and it's debatable whether it's on Daisy Ridley or the stunt person in the other engagement that her ducking and them swinging were mistimed. Was the stunt person early? Was Daisy Ridley late? Was somebody else early or late, and it altered the flow of how the whole exchange was supposed to go? I don't know. It looks like she's supposed to duck their swing, and they have to swing wild in order to keep swinging without bonking her on the head. You see things like this in fight choreography all the time in film and television, so honestly it's more of a film trivia question, but Shad presents it as if it says something about the film or Rey as a character. His video got 2.7 million views and a lot of positive comments, so clearly people were hungry to be fed material like this. Like I said, I'm not the only person who has noticed how many of these observations fall flat. There's this great Jill Barup video my friend and podcast co-host put me onto, where she talks through the achievements and drawbacks of this fight scene, with special attention paid to how this fight scene actually plays out in terms of its story beats, but she also mentions 2 things Shad mentions. Here's 2 examples of how she talks about them.
Like I said, if the movie has grabbed your attention, then the center of the frame is where you're looking, and the rest of it is just visual noise to set the scene. Like, why is this guy twirling to nowhere, for example? Or why does he aim above her head? Well, obviously it's because Daisy Ridley is supposed to duck, and she does like half a second later, and those things are supposed to come at the same time, but, not hitting Daisy Ridley in the head is more important than getting the choreography precisely correct. But the vast majority of a movie-going audience are not professionals, and they do get the point. Because the point is not the fight itself, the point is how the fight affects the characters. And because you pick the shot that serves the story best rather than the one that's most technically correct, that's how you end up with things like the knife disappearing. Because if in order to maintain continuity of placement or acting or whatever, you need to VFX out a knife that should have been dropped like 2 moves ago, You're Disney, you have the money to do that.
Seriously, go watch this video right now. I'll link it in the description along with the other channels I've mentioned earlier. It's really intriguing, and I found it to be a breath of fresh air in discussions of this film's choreography. Jill's tone is humorous, but also relaxed and devoid of the kind of seething gamer rage that accompanies a lot of material like this when it comes from people like Shad. But she also makes some good points about the production of the film that I won't belabor here. Suffice it to say that fixating on Rey as a character here, as if the fight choreography or some light mistakes in stunt work or timing somehow make her look especially bad, is not just missing the forest for the trees in a very big way, it's also putting the cart before the horse in the sense that the fight is built around advancing Rey and Kylo's characterization and the focus on them as characters, to the point where mistakes like that are very minor and don't affect the overall tone, unless you're watching the film looking for things in the background, or pausing it or watching a slowed down version somebody uploaded to YouTube. The visuals are overwhelming and focused on fluid movement that keeps the actors facing the camera and centered in one shot, which is a choice that requires sacrifices in terms of some of the other technical elements. These aren't really examples of bad combat choreography, they're actually examples of mistakes occurring in relatively competent combat choreography. The difference between those two things is that each cut and angle and series of actions comes together quite well, and if we want to nitpick, to use that awful word, we're going to be left with what are ultimately a few fun facts better suited for a documentary about the making of the film, or an IMDb page as opposed to genuine film critique. But for more of that, you'll have to like this video, comment to give me your thoughts, subscribe and click the bell so you see the next one, check out my Patreon for more goodies, and I'll see you in part 5.